My name is John Passfield. The title of this reading will be John and Dickens, Video 23, Questions 3. Here's my novella, John and Dickens, A Christmas Mystery, a novella by John Passfield. Here's John in Dickens' writing room, meeting Dickens, who's surrounded by pre-Christmas Carol characters. Turns out that there's a problem with the Christmas Carol characters. Writer John Passfield leaves his home, buys a coffee, and drives down to the shores of Lake Erie to perform a Christmas ritual, strolling along the beach at Port Maitland. It's something he's done for many years, but this year is different. This year, John suddenly finds himself in the writing room of famed Victorian novelist Charles Dickens, who sets out his new idea for a Christmas tale. Dickens invites John to watch rehearsals for the writing of the story, but as Dickens struggles through contentious negotiations with his amazingly independent characters, John wonders whether A Christmas Carol will ever be written. Well, that's the mystery of this novella. Will Dickens ever get to write the novella A Christmas Carol? How can the human mind think so many thoughts at once? How can the human mind think in so many categories of thought at once? How can the human mind not only think, but monitor itself as to whether it is thinking well or not? How can the busy human mind, caught up in the crisis of the moment, consider the questions that one element of the mind is asking of the other elements of the mind, let alone answer these questions in the heat of the moment? It's amazing that the human mind is able to function, given the barrage of imagery that it is called upon to process, even as one is sitting in a rocking chair with one's eyes closed. Let's have a look at some of the questions that one compartment in the mind of the main character, John, is asking of many of the other compartments of the mind of John as he lives through the experience of meeting Charles Dickens. So, okay, let's go to page 68 for some of these questions that the mind of John is asking other compartments, layers, levels of the mind of John. Here's one. Here are three, actually. How do you choose a topic of interest? Does each topic reveal a concern? What is the point of exploring a topic by way of a book? Okay, then to page 75 for three more questions. Do books make life seem simpler? Do they make it seem more complex? What service exactly does a book provide? Okay, then to page 78 for three more questions. Is Dickens answering any of your questions? Now, here's John living through this experience of meeting Dickens, going with Dickens to what John thinks of as rehearsals for the writing of A Christmas Carol. So the part of John's mind is wondering what's going on here. Is Dickens answering any of your questions? Is he giving you a chance to ask? Would you say that you were reluctant to pin him down? So if you think there's something going on here, and you don't know what it is, are you willing to challenge Mr. Dickens? Says one level of the mind to another level of the mind of John. Okay, that was 78. Let's go to 86. We do question ourselves as we go through life, and usually it's a healthy thing to do, right? What are the questions that should be asked? Should you be the one to ask such questions? Or should Dickens be asking questions of you? Well, if John is the reader and Dickens is the writer, and they meet, who should ask the questions? Who would know what the right questions, the best questions are? The pertinent questions, maybe I should say. Okay, let's go to page 88 for three more questions. You became a lifelong reader in your 20s. You've been a reader for almost 60 years. You've studied books and authors all that time. Okay. then to 95. What would you say has been the effect of all that reading? Would you say that your earliest reading has affected you most? What is the connection between your reading and your life? Okay, and then on to 97 for 3 more questions. What is the point about myth and ritual? What do they have to do with the living of life? Do they have any relevance at all? And then the last set of questions in the novella, as John's experience of meeting Dickens draws to a close, these 3 questions. What is the significance of the ritual that you have created? Why throw a jagged stone into the lake? Why search the windy beach for a smooth stone? Okay, all of these questions, is John's mind able to process these questions and answer them while processing all the imagery of this experience of meeting Charles Dickens, which came on him as a surprise. He wasn't planning to meet Charles Dickens at all. Why does Jesus speak in parables? Now, this is related, but not directly, okay? So it's about literature, it's about human communication, human thinking and human communication. So, why does Jesus speak in parables? I was sitting in church on a recent Sunday, and the minister read a phrase that was fascinating to me. The lesson was Matthew 22, verse 14. It started at verse 14, which is commonly known as the parable of the wedding feast. The phrase that got my attention was, quote, and again Jesus spoke to them in parables, end of quote. Well, I'm 78 years old, which means I was in my 5th year of high school, almost 60 years ago. We had a 5th year of high school in Ontario, Canada in those days as preparation for university. And I remember my English teacher, Mr. Pryor, telling we students that there was a phrase that kept turning up in our writings about literature that he wanted us never to use. The phrase he said was, quote, the author is trying to say, end of quote. The author is not trying to say something and failing, Mr. Pryor explained. The author is saying something and succeeding. And I have never forgotten Mr. Pryor's words. 60 years ago, for sure. So it occurred to me, as I was sitting in church and listening to the minister explain the parable of the wedding feast, that there are 2 answers to the question of why Jesus speaks in parables. Here's number 1. One answer would be that Jesus, in speaking in parables, is trying to say something and failing. Hence the need for someone to help Jesus to get the message across. Since Jesus is trying and failing to say what he wants to say, the minister steps in between the listener, or the reader, and Jesus, and explains what Jesus is trying, but failing, to say. So we might say that although Jesus, in speaking in parables, is failing to say what he means, fortunately, we have the minister to tell us what Jesus says, to succeed at telling us what Jesus means to say. Well, okay. Number 2, the other answer would be that Jesus, in speaking in parables, is saying exactly what he wants to say and succeeding in doing so. It's interesting that although he could have spoken in prose, and often did, of course, Jesus chose to present what I would consider to be his most important thoughts, what I would consider to be the core of his ideas in parables. Now, parables I would define as fictions. By this I mean that they present their ideas by means of characters in situations who either perform actions or who face actions to which they must respond. Unlike a prose explanation of an idea, the characters and settings are neither those of the person who's telling the story, in this case Jesus, or those of the person who's listening to the story, in this case the people of Jesus' time, or the people of my time as they sit in church on a Sunday morning. So why then would Jesus speak in parables? Well, for one thing, a parable is an idea link. It is an idea link because it connects two ideas. Number one, a person has an idea of the situation in which he or she is living. Number two, a person wonders how to respond to the situation in which he or she is living. What Jesus does is to present a parable, a fictional story with characters who are not oneself in a situation which is not one's own, and who are faced with decisions which are not the decisions with which we are faced. So what Jesus is offering is not prose advice, but an image challenge. He is challenging us to decide what the connections are. If any advice is to be given, it will be the advice from ourselves to ourselves, using the parable as a candle, a flashlight, a searchlight, as a means of illuminating the elements of the issues of our own personal situation. We ask ourselves what elements are common to the fictional situation, the parable, and our own situation in our daily lives. So, Jesus speaks in parables not because he wants to give us advice, but because he wants us to give ourselves advice after having seen ourselves from a much more objective point of view than was the case before we heard, read, and thought about the parable. In simple terms, Jesus spoke not in the language of the surface of our minds, not in the language of the prose novel, but in the language of the depths of our minds, in the language of the poetic novel, in the language of imagery. He did this because this is the deepest, most engaging level of thought and communication which is possible to the human being. So Jesus did not speak from the surface of the mind to the surface of your mind. He speaks from the depth of his mind to the depth of your mind. And that means the language of imagery. Once again, this is my novella, John and Dickens, A Christmas Mystery. It's found on Amazon. Have a look there. It's found on my publisher's website, roxmillspress.com. It's found on my website, johnpassfield.ca. 2 free books, a planning notebook and a journal. Just click on the icon. You'll have a look at those books for free on my website. And lastly, I'll say thank you for watching this video.